Welcome to Classroom Matters with Christy Houle. I'm your host, Christy Houle, and I'm here to inspire you to perfect your craft of teaching, engage your students with new and exciting experiences, and to teach with passion. Welcome to the show, and thanks for listening. I want to encourage you to visit our website at educate.today and leave a review or comment about today's show. And if you haven't already done so, while you're there, remember to sign up as a member to get access to hundreds of amazing video resources. In today's episode of Classroom Matters, I get to sit down and have a conversation with Dr. Bill Daggett. So those of you that have been along with me in my journey in education know what a huge fan I am and have been of Dr. Daggett and his work. So I am absolutely thrilled to have an opportunity to have this conversation with him today. Dr. Daggett has lived a life of education, starting as a teacher, administrator, and director with the New York State Education Department. Dr. Daggett is now the founder and chairman of the International Center for Learning Education and, as if that's not enough, the creator of the Rigor Relevance Framework. Dr. Daggett has led schools across the nation to be more future-focused, which I hope we get a chance to talk a little bit about in this interview today, to prepare students for what's ahead of them. He's written numerous books and articles and continues to lead schools on a quest for reform and transformation. Dr. Daggett, I am so thrilled to talk to you today. Welcome to Classroom Matters.
Thank you, Christy.
So I want to just dive right in and mention the upcoming Impact at Model Schools conference. Now, I've never had an opportunity to go, but from what I understand, it is a very exciting, pretty large event every year.
Yeah, Christy, we get anywhere from 5,000 to 6,000 people for the entire 3.5 days they're there. And they come as a team, usually including from classroom to boardroom. So classroom teachers, building administrators, superintendent, board member or two. And they come as a team to participate. The groups that present are the nation's most rapidly improving school districts. We do a year-long search to find the nation's most rapidly improving school districts. We go out and get under the covers to see what those schools are doing differently than other schools that are enabling them to make such great progress. And then we bring them in and they simply come and tell their story. Teachers tell what they're doing differently. Principals tell what they're doing differently. Superintendents tell what they do differently. And we provide time at the end of each day for the teams that come to participate to sit down and say, what did we hear? What could we do differently? And then by the end of the conference, we try to push them to say, okay, this has been a nice experience for 3.5 days for you. Now what you need to do is go back and take action. What are the 2 or 3 things you can do? One of the problems we always have with the conference is they get too many ideas. And when everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. So after we get them all excited about all the successful practices, we say time out. Pick the 1 or 2 that based upon the DNA of your school district really makes the most sense. And work on 2 or 3 things, not 20 things. After the conference, we then monitor throughout the year how are they doing. And we have a lot of things like this podcast and webinars and other things to just sit with them to talk through the progress they're making. So it's proven to be a wonderful event. It's now one of the largest conferences in the country. Interestingly, we don't advertise it. It's basically word of mouth. It's schools telling other schools, and it's proven to be an exciting event for us, Christy.
So you hit a little bit on what I was going to ask you, and that is when folks go to conferences, as you mentioned, we get really excited and super hyped up, but then we leave and we sort of sometimes just leave all of those great ideas at the conference. How often do you monitor and check in with these model schools and these teams to make sure that they are having accountability for some of the ideas and strategies that they walked away with?
It varies district by district. What I typically ask people to do is do 20-day plans. Not only do I want them to limit the 2 or 3 things they're going to go after, we ask them to be very specific about what they're going to do in the next 20 days. And say, don't try to solve the ills of the world in 20 days. Take your first steps. Take your 2 or 3 steps. What are they? And how are you going to know whether you actually were successful in those steps? What we typically do then, Christy, is check back in at the end of those 20 days to say, how you doing? How'd you do in your 20-day plan? Now, what's your next 20-day plan? By taking those steps in 20 days at a time, we find it leads to, with a series of 20-day plans, by the end of the year, really substantive change. What happens with every teacher, with every administrator, they're well-intended, but, they get back home and, 50 things come at them, both professionally and personally. And change and innovation take a back seat when you have daily pressures. The 20-day plan puts that right up there because they know in 20 days they're going to hear back from me. It causes it to make it a higher priority.
And probably a little bit of pressure.
Yeah, it is a little bit of pressure. We hope gentle and not overly stressful pressure, but people want to be held accountable. People want to change. We just give them a little structure to make sure it happens.
So now this is such a large conference. And as I was reading about it, I was really curious as to how you were able to get involved with this. Is this something that you were sort of helping to develop from the get-go, or is this model schools conference something that you joined once it had already begun?
No, we created it. I had been a teacher and an administrator, as you noted in the introduction, and then I was a state ed department official in New York State. And what I found was state agencies and USDOE as well, because of pressures on those agencies, they have become more regulatory. They tell districts what to do and then monitor the legislation. And they weren't providing enough technical assistance. And what schools really wanted was technical assistance. And so when I left the department, I created the International Center for Leadership and Education to help try to create some of that technical assistance. But within a couple years of starting the International Center, and I started that 29 years ago, it became clear that what they didn't want to just hear from me, they wanted to see the schools that were doing it. So we held our first international conference, Model Schools Conference, 27 years ago at the Raleigh Hilton Hotel in Raleigh, North Carolina. We anticipated we might get 200 or 300 people, and we got 1,300 in a hotel that was suited to run a conference for 300. We ended up literally renting circus tents, putting it in the parking lot and in an adjoining parking lot, and we were off and running. And that conference now is in its 27th year. It went from 1,300 the first year to 2,000 the second year to 3,000 the third year. By the fifth year, it was up to 5,000, and we've stayed at that number now for all the way up to this, which will be our 27th conference.
Wow, that's incredible. And it just, I'm thinking about what you're saying. And as an educator myself, it just goes to show you how truly hungry educators are to be better and to do better, even sometimes working in a system or in environments that are resistant to some of those changes. And so I wanted to kind of ask you a little bit too about, in some of your most recent articles, and I know at this upcoming conference, you talk a lot about forward focused versus future focused. So I was really interested about that concept.
Yeah, most school districts, by the nature of the pressure put on school districts, they are what I call forward focused. A forward focused school district is always looking at what they're now doing and how to improve it. Let's begin at the school board superintendent level. When they put their budget together, they begin that budgeting process by saying, what do we have in place? And how much more money will we need to have to continue to do what we're doing. And they look at all the natural things from the buildings to the contracts and so on. If you're a teacher, you look at, well, last year, what lessons really worked well for me? What ones do I think weren't so good and I want to tweak a little bit to improve? It's always what I call a continuous improvement process, always trying to continue to improve on what we did in the past. That is a forward-focused school. That's what most schools are. That's what most classrooms are. In the nation's most rapidly improving schools, those schools that we showcase at the model schools, they don't do that. And they don't do it because they said it's based upon a basic belief that what we did in the past is what we need to do in the future. And what they do instead is they put a stake in the ground 3 to 5 years out. And they say, what will kids need to know, do, be like in this changing world? A world driven by technology, a world today where our kids are increasingly struggling with mental health issues. What needs to be different? And what we find is that many of the things that we teach and have taught in the past are in conflict with what they'll actually use once they leave school. Let me give you an example. We don't let kids use, and I understand why, that we don't let kids use an iPhone when they take a state test. And I ask audiences all the time, give me one word why we don't let them use it. What would they do? And the audience yells back, they would cheat. And then I say, how would they make it? How would they be cheating? And they said, well, they either go look up the answer, Google the answer, or they'll text their friends. So I say, so they might either use resources or work with others. Well, if you put a stake in the ground 3 to 5 years out, even if you look at today, what are the two most basic skills a child needs to become independent as an adult? Use resources, work with others. And so are we trying to force 21st century technology to conform to our 20th century schools? Or are we trying to transform our 20th century schools into the world of the 21st century, which our children will live, work, and interact in? The future-focused schools begin to say the old system needs fundamental change. So a future-focused school creates the culture that will enable you to reform your schools to prepare kids better for their future. A forward-focused school simply tries to get better at the past. And the past, well, some of it is important. Much of it is not what our kids need to be successful in the 21st century.
Yeah, and that is so true. And when you put it like that, like I know that we could not be in person today for this interview, but if you could see me, I'm just like smiling as you're talking because it just makes sense, right? I mean, especially the way in which you're putting it, but it is so hard for educators who have done things a certain way for so long to see the good in those types of changes. And it also kind of makes me feel better about letting my kids use a calculator with some of their math problems when they don't know how to figure it out. But, talking a little bit about being resistant and some of the things that we have to do to change and transform, as a teacher or a principal, how do we do some of those things and challenge some of these longstanding practices without creating a negative work environment?
Well, first of all, you got to have people understand that our schools aren't failing because they're not failing by historical standards. We're graduating more kids. They got more tests to take. They got more standards to cover than ever before. I often say culture trumps strategy. You have to create a culture which says, I really want to be future focused. I want to prepare kids for their future, not necessarily for the next grade, the next test, the next level of education, until which, parenthetically, Christy, most of them fall off the educational ladder before they ever graduate from college.
Right.
And so what I recommend is don't go in and and tell everybody they got to change. We recommend that you do an awareness program. And I talked a minute ago about future focus. I often do presentations that show 3 to 5 years out how fundamentally technology in the world itself is going to continue to change. I show them the projections on the increase in mental health issues. 1 in 12 high school students this past year cut themselves. 16% of students in an AMA survey indicated they had contemplated suicide. They are incredibly alarming pieces of data. I look at those and say, do you think maybe we need to do some things a little differently? And then you ask for volunteers. And what we find typically is about a third of the staff jump up and say, I want to try something different. I'm okay. Let me try something different. A third say, maybe, however, how's it going to impact the test? What about the standards? They're not negative people. They're realists. But unfortunately, we often have another third that basically say, over my dead body, will you mess up my 2005 laminated lesson plan? What you don't want to do is threaten that bottom third. Right. An internecine warfare. Instead, what you want to do is empower that top third to try some things differently. Work with them slowly, gradually. Make change evolutionary, not revolutionary. That top third will figure it out. That top third are the kind of people that come to the Model Schools Conference. Chrissy, I really don't know your audience, but here's my hunch. Your audience on your podcast are probably the top third. And what you do is empower them. In the middle third, watch them. In the middle third, once they see what the top third is doing and the kids are doing better and it really works, the middle third were never really resistant. They just weren't sure. They joined. And then you got 2/3 of your staff. Then you have the critical mass that really turns the school around. But that takes 3 to 5 years. You're not going to change a school district in one professional development event. You're not going to change it in 1 year. It takes 3 to 5 years for a true transformation of the school district.
Right. And I think that you mentioning the monitoring and the following up and the accountability, because talking about the one professional development, unfortunately, so many times I think that we do throw these drive-by professional developments at educators and expect these great changes, and it just doesn't happen and it falls short. And so, kudos to you for the work that you're doing with the Model Schools Conference and these groups. And, talking about the top third and the middle and those types of folks, what are some specific things that teachers can start doing? So if they said, yes, Dr. Daggett, I want to be in the top third, I want to do things different. I don't want to be the sage on the stage anymore. What sort of advice or a few just specific strategies would you give them walking into their class next week, ready to do something different?
I'll give you 3. Number 1, they should focus more on the students than the content. If you think about all of our professional development and all the focus over the last decade, because of the standards movement and the test movement, which I'm not opposed to, but because of that, we became highly focused on content. When I was in the state ed department in New York, I headed up curriculum and testing. I can tell you that the standards of today's curriculum, today's test, are not dramatically different than they were 10 and 20 years ago. They're different on the margin. What is fundamentally different are the kids. These kids are natives of a technological world. They've grown up in a world fundamentally different than the 20th century kids, which the adults were. The kids have changed more. So try to get the kids and ask the kids every day to make sure you, the teacher, answer this question. Where will I ever use what you're teaching me today? How is this relevant? Show me where it's really relevant, because that's rigor and relevance. Once the kids see something is relevant, they're more motivated to address the academic rigor we want to get them to. So it's It's changing that focus, the focus on the kids, what's relevant to the kids. It doesn't change what you teach. It fundamentally changes how you teach. Second item we recommend is because of, again, the fixation on testing, we have become focused on proficiency rather than growth. In any one classroom, teacher might have 25 kids. First day of class, if I'm a fourth grade teacher, 2 or 3 of those kids probably aren't ready to do fourth grade work. 1 or 2 of them with extra help might be able to do fifth grade work. Yet that teacher is expected to get all 25 of those kids, despite the fact that they are different in academics. Some of those kids have more emotional stress. 25 kids in a classroom, 1 or more of them, their parents will break up this year. Really traumatic for the kid. 1 or more of them will be out of school for an extended period of time because they're ill. Yet that teacher is expected to get all those kids to the exact same place on one given hour, on one given test, because of our proficiency model. That is lunacy. It's not going to happen. So what these districts have done is said, rather than just focusing on this one-time test for proficiency, we're going to try to focus on growth. I'm going to try to grow every child as far as I can grow them. So they use things like the Relevance Framework and measure every month how kids are doing in reading in terms of increasing their reading skill. And lots of products from all the major publishers have the Lexile score embedded within their materials if we want to use them. In math, there's something called the Quanta framework that you could do the same thing with. But they moved to this growth model. And what we found is we picked all these high-performing schools because of their increased test scores. But what astounded us is they spent less time focused on the test. They spent their time focused on growth, which parenthetically led to great improvement in test scores. The third and final thing is it's the Rigor and Relevance Framework. Too complicated to describe verbally without a visual in front of the audience. But in effect, it goes back to that relevance issue, making sure that whatever I teach, I try to show the kids how it is relevant to what they are either now doing in their lives or will do as adults. The kids that do well in school today are basically the obedient kids. They're doing what you're telling them to do because you've told them to do it. Not all those kids are obedient in our schools. You got to make sure they're motivated. Relevance motivates them, Christy.
That's such good advice. And those are, 3 things that are just priceless as far as really digging into it. And I'm taking notes as you're talking, and I'm, this is just, it's so true to what we're doing today. And it's hard. It's hard for teachers to make these changes. And I know that you speak about that a lot. Teachers work as hard as they can. And it's just more of, we're just continuing to do things the way that we've always done them, as you said, even though our kids are changing, the culture's changing. And so it's just going to be a lot of work to get all of the education systems exactly where they should be, and performing in the way that we want to. And I love how you talk so much about relationships and relevance with students and not just the content. So I know that you have a large family and you work a lot. So how are you balancing all of this extraordinary work that you're doing at conferences with family time as well?
It's always a struggle. However, I do have to travel a lot, but my wife would tell you it's better than when I was a school administrator or a state ed department official, because when I'm home, meaning I'm not pulled out for 40 different issues as administrators are, as teachers are. My evenings are free. My weekends are totally free. We clearly have much more quality time together as a family. And of course, now it's with grandchildren because my kids are all growing, although we do have a severely disabled daughter who's still with us. But the other 4, we have 5 kids. The other 4 are out on their own. But we now have 13 grandchildren, and our house is a busy house most weekends. So I do have evenings when I'm home, and I clearly have weekends with a family that I didn't really have so much when I was a teacher and an administrator.
Yeah, and that quality time is great. And I know I've listened to you speak several times, and I believe I've heard you say that two of your children might actually work for you
They
or
do.
with you.
They do.
How's that work out when you disagree on something?
Yeah, it works out fine. I have actually two organizations. I'm a founder and chairman of the International Center for Leadership in Education, which that's where the model schools resides and most of our work in terms of consulting with schools are. But I also chair a group called, and I created it, a not-for-profit called the Successful Practices Network. And historically, we've got a lot of funding from the Gates Foundation and state ed departments and other places. And we do a lot of research over there on the model schools. In fact, the model school research is actually done at the not-for-profit. One of my sons is the director of research over in that organization, and one of my sons is the chief operating officer of that organization. And it works out fine. They actually don't report directly to me. They report to Ray McNulty, who is our president of the not-for-profit. Ray reports to me, so I do have my hand in it a little bit, but it's worked out fine. They've done a great job for us.
So, what do you have coming up, Dr. Daggett? Any new books, events that you want to talk about that we haven't gotten to?
Yeah. Obviously, we have the Model Schools Conference in late June. If anybody wants to know about that, just Google Model Schools Conference. It'll pop up right away. But I'm doing a lot with AASA, that's American Association of School Superintendents. I'm co-chairing a national study for them on innovation. I'm also co-chairing a second national study for them around social, emotional / mental health, where we're working with 40 districts that are really trying to figure out how to address this growing problem nationally, networking them together. So those two things together with the Model Schools Conference and my ongoing speaking, my plate's pretty full.
Well, Dr. Daggett, thank you so much for coming on the Classroom Matters podcast. I know that our listeners are going to take some of the ideas and strategies you mentioned and move forward with transforming their classrooms and schools. You are making such a difference and an impact with the work that you have done and that you are doing. And I am so grateful for the time that you have been able to spend with me today.
Thank you, Chrissy, and thanks for doing these podcasts. They're helpful to teachers. Thanks a lot.
And that's going to wrap it up for this episode of Classroom Matters with me, your host, Christy Houle. Once again, don't forget to visit the website at educate.today and leave us a comment about the show. If you haven't already signed up as a member, please don't forget, sign up as a member so you can have access to all of the great resources for you and your classroom setting. This is Christy Houle. Until next time.